We three kings, Saul, David, and Jonathan. Um, Moving on, as we are getting into some of the heart of David and his start, um, really his start in training to become the king that he eventually would become in Israel. And now we're getting into Saul having some victory, but not being able to handle someone else getting the credit. So we just finished up in chapter 17, and we're entering chapter 18 here. And we see in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, verse 1, that as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out, was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul sent him over the men of war. This was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Interesting that it doesn't say it was good in the sight of Saul. We have something happening here, right? With David and Jonathan. Jonathan, his soul was knit to the soul of David, right? That's kind of an interesting thing to say. He loved him as his own soul. Let's explore that a little bit more and see if we can dive into what that may have looked like otherwise. If we look in chapter 20, we see in verse 30, Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he will surely die." It's kind of an interesting way to put it, right? You've chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness. All right, so let's move on. Verse 41, 42. And then we see something else that, especially in our society today, might make us a little bit uncomfortable, right? We see, as soon as the boy had gone, so this is Jonathan's servant, David rose from beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times, and they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, because we've sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. What is going on with this relationship between David and Jonathan? David's supposed to be a man after God's own heart, and we know what the scriptures say about homosexuality, right? Was that what was going on here in this relationship? Well, first of all, I don't want to say any more than Scripture says or any less than Scripture says, and Scripture does not say one way or the other if that's what was going on in this relationship. Could have been. I'm not going to deny that, but it may not have been. One thing Scripture clearly does not talk about at all is Jonathan and David acting on any of those feelings, if they did have any of those feelings for each other, right? They never acted on it, if they did. We also see, and we're very aware, that David, he definitely had a thing for women, right? And it got him in trouble. Got him in a lot of trouble with Bathsheba. So we know there's at least that. And David was the one who was weeping the most when he had to leave, right? And he and Jonathan were parted from each other. The point being, even if there was something going on, they didn't act on it. There are definitely people that have homosexual feelings today, and you can say you're born that way. Some are, some may choose it, who knows? It doesn't really matter. What matters is, do you act on those things? Because we all have desires that go in certain directions, so what matters is, do we act on those things? Desire... Let's look at James real quick when we talk about desire. James chapter 1 has some very interesting things to say about it and some very clear things to say about it as well. We see in chapter 14, each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. By the way, Before that, chapter 13, let no one say, or verse 13 of James 1, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So, first of all, it doesn't look like there's any indication that they allowed any desire to give birth to sin here, right? And sin definitely didn't become full grown. If any of that was even going on, this may just be something where we are interpreting this passage based on our own experiences in our day and time and our culture. Their culture could have far more affectionate relationships between men than we seem to be able to have, and not take it to a direction that it was never meant to be anyway. But the point is, it doesn't really matter in the end, because we know what they did, and we know that they treated things right in the end. So the big thing to understand here is Jonathan, again, as he does over and over throughout his whole life, has more faith than his father Saul does. We know that, and we see that, and we'll continue to see it as we move forward through here. At any rate, David has success wherever he goes. Wherever Saul sends him, David has success. Everybody loves him, except maybe for Saul. Verse 6, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. So here we're going to get an explanation of why Saul was left out of the ones who thought everything David did was good. Verse 7, the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul was very angry, verse 8, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul's starting to put things together a little bit here, right? What more can he have but the kingdom? God rejected me, he's going to anoint someone else. This might be the person that God is putting in place of me. Good for him for finally recognizing someone's going to be in place of him. He had a choice. He could have responded well here and continued to train David in good faith, saying, David, you're going to take over after me, so here are some things you can do. But in the end, this is not what he did, and we'll see that very clearly here. At any rate, I mean, honestly, Saul had gone out and conquered Philistines and conquered many, many more than David had up to this point. Right? David slayed the Philistine. He slayed the giant. He slayed Goliath. Yes, absolutely. But he hadn't slayed as many as Saul had, as far as Israel's enemies to this point. So if it were me, I'd probably be thinking, yeah, my anger's justified right here. I can't believe they do that. That's ridiculous, and be a little bit jealous. But again, desire, when it has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So here we start seeing this sin giving birth in Saul toward David, and we're going to see that being fully conceived, and eventually it is going to end in death. And we'll see how that goes. Verse 10, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre. As he did day by day, Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Yeah, David evaded him twice. So this didn't just happen once. David's having to run away a couple of times from Saul here as Saul's anger is kindled against him. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Saul knew. Saul had seen the work of the Lord in his life, and he had seen himself quench the Spirit of the Lord. And now he sees the Lord is with David, And he knows that he's got that tormenting spirit inside of him working against the things that he'd like to be doing. Now, Saul, who had tried to kill David, Saul is afraid of David instead of David being afraid of Saul. That's a curious thing, right? But remember, David believed God. So even after he's being chased and evades Saul twice, trying not to be killed by him, he still understands God has anointed him to be king, and he has not taken that kingship yet. He believed God. He's going to follow God. Verse 13, so Saul removed him, David, from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. So he was afraid of him, and now he's amazed by what's going on. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. So what we see, just as a literary device, in verse 5, when it talks about David going out, being successful wherever Saul sends him, and Saul setting him up over the men of war, it's kind of the outline. And we're going to discuss what was going on. And then that's what he discusses in verses 6 through 16 here. So all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. That's the explanation of what had happened. Now, remember, there was another thing that was supposed to happen to anyone who slayed Goliath, and that thing is a wife, one of Saul's daughters, in fact. So verse 17, then Saul said to David, here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? He didn't consider that a position that he wanted to usurp. But at the time, 19, when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, Saul had made the decree, that's just what it was, she was given to Adriel, the Meholathite, for a wife. Okay, she's given to somebody else instead. Verse 20, now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. Do this thing, right? And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David, and David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? Kind of an interesting thing to say, right? He's a poor man and has no reputation, and yet the things that have already been done in and through him, seems like he has a little bit of a reputation going on, yeah? Verse 24, the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king desires no bride price. See, in those days, you had to give a dowry, a bride price, right? If you were going to get married, it was expected you give a payment to the father for the daughter. That's how that stuff worked. We don't exactly do that now. We have rings and things like that, so that's our payment, I guess, but it doesn't go to the father for the daughter so much. And these days, you gave a payment to the father for his daughter, and David had nothing to give. That's why he said, I am a poor man. Who am I? I can't afford any kind of a bride price. So Saul says, all right, here we go. The king desires no bride price, except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. He wasn't saying go out there and convert Philistines and and circumcise them in the customary Jewish tradition. No, he was talking about him going out and fighting them, and so he wanted the Philistines to kill him. Verse 26, when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. So, this is something David says, now this I can accomplish. God has given Philistines into my hands before. He can do it now. I'll do this thing. So he goes, At the end of verse 26, before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines, not just 100. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter, Michal, for a wife. Wonder how begrudgingly he gave his daughter at that point. Verse 28, but when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. I'm going to say not just David's enemy at this point, right? I mean, you think Saul might have also been working against God's plan at this point? Actively working against God's plan? Trying in any way he could to overcome what God had set up? Remember, Samuel told him, God is not a man that he should regret what he's chosen for you, Saul. He's not going to regret this consequence. He has rejected you, and he's chosen someone after his own heart. But, Saul was not a man after God's own heart. So instead, he's working against him. He wasn't just David's enemy at this point. He was God's enemy. This was a man who God would have used had he been willing to use. May we always be willing to be used by God instead of fighting against him or looking internally to ourselves instead of trusting in God. Verse 30 of chapter 18, then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. So he goes from being poor, of no reputation, now he is the king's son-in-law, and his name is highly esteemed. God has lifted him up quite a bit. Excellent. We see success. Very good. Now, chapter 19. Saul spoke to Jonathan, to his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. Jonathan could see, look, even though you've been rejected, he's not trying to take the kingship at this point. He's bringing good to you. Just enjoy what he's bringing in, right? Enjoy the goodness that God is still showing you despite your sin. Man, how often does God do that, right? He still shows us good despite our own sin. And despite the way that we treat him, he still treats us so well. So, he said, he brought good to you, for he took his life in his hand, struck down the Philistine. The Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he will not be put to death. Now, little did he know he was correct in that. David was not put to death, as the Lord lives. But that wasn't what Saul ended up trying to follow through with. He didn't even keep his own vows that he made himself. Sad times. Verse 7, and Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. Verse 8 of chapter 19 in 1 Samuel. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines, and struck them with a great blow, so that they fled before him. Then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, as he sat in his house with a spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre. Okay. War again, more success. Hooray, good stuff, yeah. And then the harmful spirit comes again on Saul. And rather than turning back to the Lord, he just lets that build up within him. David's playing the lyre, and Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. But he eluded Saul so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Now, this is either a retelling of the event that was already told about, or Saul tried again. Either way, I would not be surprised, right? I mean, Saul does not seem to learn a lot of lessons here, which should be a lesson for me and for you, right? That we need to learn the lessons that God is trying to teach us. We need to look back on our lives and see where God has worked, count those blessings, learn from them, and then grow in wisdom. Not just knowledge, but wisdom, that skillful application of knowledge to our lives, which is what wisdom is. So David fled and he escaped that night. Verse 11, Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. Again, this is that literary thing where it says David fled and escaped that night, and here's how it happened, right? The next verses. So Michal tells him, you're going to be killed. You got to leave now. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes. How ironic is that? She takes an image. That image, it could just be a statue, but in all likelihood, it was some kind of an idol as well. Even in believing in the Lord, even in trusting in the Lord, it's so easy to keep these other things in our lives and to not get rid of them and not put them away. But that's what she did. She put the image, maybe it was just a statue. At any rate, she puts it in the bed, and Saul sent messengers to take David. She said, he's sick. Verse 15, Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed, with the pillow of goat's hair at its head. Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me thus, and let my enemy go, that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? Yeah, well, okay, so she's lying to her father, right? Easy to say that he deserves it, but there was no reason for her to lie. She could have trusted in God as well, and everything been fine. But what we see in verse 18 is that David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. Okay? So we'll pick up again next time, but now we see David is back with someone that he knows also believes in the things that the Lord has said and the things that the Lord has promised about David, and he goes and lives with Samuel in Naioth. What this is going to do, so all the training that he has with Saul, as far as how to be a king, how to be a man of war, how to do these things, he's getting excellent training. Obviously, he flees that situation, right? He has to run from it. And then he goes and he's there with Samuel. And Samuel, what is he going to learn from him? He's going to learn more judge things that remembered. Samuel was the judge for Israel, and he was going to set his sons up as judges, but they were no good. So he's going to learn things about how to judge Israel well under Samuel as he lives with him. And hopefully he learns more spiritual things as well. But we know he's a man after God's heart. And ultimately, he's going to continue to do what he needs to do, trusting God for the results. He will do trusting. We'll pick that up next time with David at Samuel's place, and see what happens after that. Thanks.